Hello class 6. Welcome to our English language class week 12. These weeks we are learning about the verb. In our last class we learned about the verb in general and also the forms of verb, that is main verb, helping verb and also modal verbs. Today we are going to learn about objects of the verb. Kindly watch the video lesson very attentively. Let us begin today's class. Chapter 10, Objects of Verbs. First of all, let us look at an interesting conversation between a little girl and a magician. You will find this conversation in your textbook, page number 57. The little girl tells the magician, "Magician, make me a cartoon." The magician is pronouncing some magical words and he is telling, "Here you become a cartoon." Then the girl tells, "Oh, I told you to make a cartoon for me." What is the problem here? The girl actually asked the magician to make a cartoon for her, but the magician turns the girl into a cartoon. So there was some confusion in the magician's understanding of what the girl said, how it happened. You will understand how this confusion took place after learning about objects of verbs. So let us learn about objects of verbs. A verb can have two types of objects, direct object and indirect object. First of all, let us try to understand what is meant by direct object. Every sentence must have a verb. The verb may tell about action, that is doing words, state, which are be verbs, or possession, have verbs in a sentence. So the verb may tell about action, state, or possession in a sentence. Let us look at some examples. Danny painted the wall. The verb painted speaks about action. Grandma is unwell today. The verb is speaking about the state of grandma, the condition of grandma. Grandma is unwell. The fort has stone walls. The verb has is telling about possession. The actions represented by the verbs are performed by someone. The performer or doer of the action may be the subject in a sentence. Let us analyze an example. Sarah picked strawberries. Sarah picked strawberries. In this sentence, Sarah is subject, picked is the verb. And that verb picked is speaking about action, and the performer of the action is Sarah, the subject. And also there is a receiver of the action, or someone or somebody or something who is affected by the action. And here that someone or something is strawberries. We call this receiver of the action direct object. So in this sentence, the action conveyed by the verb picked is performed by the subject Sarah, and the action picked affects or is received by another noun, that is strawberries, and that is the direct object of the verb picked. Let us look at another example. The surgeon operated on grandmother's hurting knee. The surgeon operated on grandmother's hurting knee. In this sentence, the noun phrase the surgeon is the subject and operated is the verb. The action conveyed by the verb operated is performed by the subject, the surgeon. Also in this sentence, the action operated affects or received by another noun phrase, that is grandmother's hurting knee. And this noun phrase we call the direct object. So, the noun phrase or pronoun that receives or is affected by the action indicated by the verb in a sentence is the direct object of the verb. Once again, listen attentively. The noun phrase or pronoun that receives or is affected by the action indicated by the verb in a sentence is the direct object of the verb. And the object of the verb usually follows the verb, which means we usually write the object of the verb after the verb. There is an easy way to find out the direct object. Let us know how it is done. How to find the direct object? To find the direct object, ask what or whom after the verb in the sentence. For example, Sia gave some food. Gave what? Some food. So that some food is the direct object. So once again, to find the direct object, ask what or whom after the verb in the sentence. Here, look at the example. Sia gave some food. We ask the question, gave what? And you get the answer, some food. So that answer, some food, is the direct object of that sentence. Now we go to indirect object. As we said in the beginning, some verbs take two objects after them. First, a direct object that receives or is affected by the action of the verb in a sentence. A direct object that receives or is affected by the action of the verb in a sentence. The direct object is a thing or a person. And secondly, an indirect object that receives or is affected by the direct object. An indirect object that receives or is affected by the direct object. The indirect object is usually a living being, a person or an animal, to or for whom the action is done. Let us look at an example. The dentist gave me an injection. The dentist gave me an injection. Let us ask, gave what? The answer is an injection. The dentist gave what? The answer is an injection. So in this sentence, an injection is the direct object of the verb gave, while me is the indirect object receiving the direct object, an injection. So once again, in this sentence, an injection is the direct object of the verb gave, while me is the indirect object receiving the direct object, an injection. In the following table, let us analyze a few more examples. First of all, the subject is what the sentence is about. Verb expresses the action. Indirect object is one who receives the direct object. And a direct object is a thing or person affected by the action. Listen to these examples. The banker paid the man his money. The banker is the subject and paid is the verb which expresses the action, and the man is the indirect object, the one who receives the direct object, his money, and his money is the direct object which is affected by the action paid. In the second sentence, grandma sent me a dress. Here the subject is grandma and send is the verb which expresses the action, and me is the indirect object. It is the one who receives the direct object, a dress, and a dress is the direct object which is affected by the action conveyed through the verb sent. The indirect object is usually a person or an animal and always comes before the direct object. However, we can rephrase the sentence to place the indirect object after the preposition to or for. So indirect object is usually a person or animal and always comes before the direct object. However, we can rephrase the sentence. We can say in a different way to place the indirect object after the preposition to or for. In such cases, the direct object comes before the indirect object. So when you rephrase the sentence using to or for before the indirect object, the direct object will come first and the indirect object will come at the last. You will understand better by looking at these examples. My father wrote the principal a letter. My father wrote the principal a letter. Here, my father wrote what? A letter. So a letter is the direct object and the principal is the indirect object. So we are going to rephrase it using to before the indirect object principal. My father wrote a letter to the principal. My father wrote a letter to the principal. So here when we used to before the indirect object, we placed the direct object before the indirect object. Another example. Harry bought the children some candies. Harry bought what? Some candies. So some candies is the direct object and the children is the indirect object. We are going to rephrase this sentence using for before the indirect object, the children. Harry bought some candies for the children. So look here, we have placed the preposition for before the indirect object, the children, and therefore we placed the direct object, some candies, before the indirect object. How to find the indirect object? To find the indirect object, ask to whom or for whom after the verb. Look at this example. Sia gave the child some food. Gave to whom? The child. So the child is the indirect object. Now before we end, let us go back to that interesting conversation that we saw in the beginning between the little girl and the magician. Here the little girl is telling the magician, "Magician, make me a cartoon." Let us analyze that sentence. You is the subject which is understood. Make is the verb and there are two objects, me and a cartoon. One object may be direct object and another an indirect object. How do we find out the direct object? We ask the question what after the verb. So let us ask, make what? Make a cartoon. So a cartoon is the direct object and me is the indirect object. Now when the girl realized that the magician misunderstood what she said, she rephrases her request and tells, "I told you to make a cartoon for me." So she used a preposition for before the indirect object me, and then everything became clear to the magician. So here we end our lesson today. I hope you have understood the difference between direct object and indirect object, and also you have learned how to identify direct object and indirect object. Now after watching the video lesson, kindly go through chapter 10 of the textbook and also try to complete the exercises given at the end of the chapter. Thank you and have a nice day.